The only real way to stop illegal entry is a deterrent. In other words, it's not worth it. There's no point you paying this money. There's no point you putting your life at risk. There's no point you getting here because you won't be allowed to stay. And actually back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, when I was working in immigration enforcement in London or at the border, we did exactly that.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, former head of Border Force Tony Smith talks about securing our border.
The government's in a real pickle on this, in that it's clear that the smuggling gangs at the moment are winning this.
Tony says illegal immigrants are not subject to the thorough checks that come with legal entry, allowing dangerous people into Britain.
It's all about speed. It's about getting them out of the water, getting them into dry clothes, taking their fingerprints and then getting them off into a hotel. That worries me. I think we need to be much, much more thorough at the point of interception whilst we've got them in our clutches.
Tony talks about student visas, terrorism, and why our current laws make securing Britain's borders more difficult.
I think a lot of officers feel completely undermined now because asylum and human rights actually largely trump border control. Once you're in that system, there's nothing we can do until you come out the other end of that system, and even then it's quite difficult.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders, I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Tony Smith, former head of UK Border Force. Tony, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So border security is a bit of a hot topic. We've got people who say that we should go open borders now and that's a problem. People who say they're too tightly controlled. I mean, you were 4 decades managing this at the highest levels. How would you describe the state of Britain's borders?
Well, I don't think it's just Britain's borders, actually. I think, worldwide borders are coming under increasing pressure, both from both angles, really. There are some people, as you say, who don't want any borders. They think we should just all go and live where we like. Yeah. And there are others who want to put a wall or a fence around a country and keep everybody out. And, of course, the middle ground is always somewhere between the two. But I think at the moment, the real pressures particularly on the UK and the EU, are to try and get rid of illegal or irregular migration, as it's called, to stop people coming across without proper identity documents, passports, visas and the rest of it, because I think people are just seeing more and more of this with social media and TV coverage these days, that they think, well, that can't be right. I mean, if I go on my holidays to Spain or somewhere, I have to queue up and show my passport, and I wouldn't and yet people can just get in a small boat and get across to the UK without these things, and we don't send them back. I think people would struggle to understand why that is. That sort of a sense of cheating or unfairness, and I think that kind of, although it's quite a small number in the overall scheme of migrants, it's still a very touchy subject politically. And so you are seeing political movements, I think, to the right in a lot of countries to try and tighten up on irregular or illegal migration. And of course, meanwhile, you've got these regular, lawful migratory routes that are still going on. We've had record levels in the UK of lawful migration in the last 2 or 3 years, which people find difficult to understand. Economists will say that's good for the economy, it's good we get more people here, more growth. On others will say, well, yeah, but it puts a huge pressure on our public services and our communities, and we're feeling this now, and we don't really want more and more people coming in. So it's never really out of the news. There's always something to talk about, and it's been my whole life, as you say.
I mean, we've always, for a long time, we've had asylum seekers coming here, but it seems recently we've got a lot of economic migrants who are entering illegally. What was it that changed that stopped the system from working so well?
So, actually, the policy on asylum was always, going back to the 80s, to stop people getting to the border to claim asylum in the first place. That's why we have visa systems, we get the airlines to check passports, the ferry companies, carriers liability and so on. We put our border in France, actually, so that you couldn't get here to claim asylum, and yet perversely, in order to claim asylum, you have to be in the country. So this has been constantly a tension about, well, how do you cater for people who are genuinely in fear of persecution, and for those that are coming across, well, they have to get in illegally in order to make their claim. So, I mean, there's always been a mixture, I think, of economic migrants and genuine refugees. I think the real problem we have, is, particularly in the UK, is that a lot of the migrants we're talking about on the English Channel have been in the EU for quite some considerable time. They're not in immediate fear of persecution, but they may face persecution were you to return them to Afghanistan or Sudan or Syria. So basically, you've got people moving across, more and more people moving across borders, trying to find a new home. And they're what we would call asylum shopping, really. I don't really want to stay in France. I'd rather stay in the UK. And you've lost, because of the politics of all this, the capacity to return people who don't qualify for asylum, or to exclude them from the asylum system because they come from a safe third country, you see. So I think the problem with asylum is that the supply is much, much greater than the demand from countries to accept people. And of course, criminal gangs and migrants, economic migrants, will take advantage of that and say, well, actually, if I can get to the UK and lodge an asylum claim, whether or not I'm genuine, there's a very good chance that I'll be allowed to stay. And that just encourages more to come, you see.
A couple of points on illegal immigrants I wanted to get your views on. Are the illegal immigrants subject to the same scrutiny and safety checks as those who come here legally?
Good question. I mean, what we rely upon a lot is the passport, actually. I mean, the passport tells a story. And so I spent a lot of my time checking people's passports when they came into Heathrow, when I was an officer on the line, and that tells you is that this is the right person.
So that gives you get loads of information.
You get a lot of information, passport stamps, where have you been, what are you doing? You'd ask people questions about what they're doing, and if you weren't happy with the story, you'd send them back again on the same plane they arrived, of course. So people want to avoid that process. They're going to try and avoid the border control. So they will try and find other ways of crossing borders. And so with illegal migrants, the norm is not to have a passport, even if you had one when you left your own country, not to turn up with one, because that conceals a lot of information about you from us. In particular, we don't know where you're from or where you've been. So we have people who sometimes give false declarations about their age, sometimes about their nationality, sometimes about their travel history, which is all basically what they tell you, but is not documented because there's no evidence of that. So the checks we do when they arrive on things like small boats is we can take your biometrics, we can fingerprint you, we can photograph you, we can ask you questions, but we won't get the same level of information out of you as we would have done if we'd have been able to check your passport, you see. So there are problems now in screening large numbers of irregular migrants. Some of them are fairly innocent irregular migrants who just want a new home somewhere else. But there is some mischief going on. There is evidence that some people are permeating borders who have got criminal intentions or security problems, which we can't really... How are you going to know by looking at somebody if they haven't got any documents, you've got no background evidence? It doesn't come up on any databases anywhere. This person is a criminal or a terrorist. It's really quite hard to do, particularly when you've got so many coming in such a short period of time. So we do see cases, sadly, where people were pushed through very quickly through the process at Western Jetfoil and Manston into hotels, and then later on, after a while their asylum claims are being considered, then something dreadful happens, and people say, well, why did you let them in the first place? Well, you wouldn't have known that. You can't tell what's in someone's mind. We have got good debriefing teams, but we can't debrief everybody, not if we get a big intake day. So I think there is a real problem with border security with this sort of huge movement of undocumented people, where we're not able to do some of the checks that perhaps we would like to do.
So that sounds very difficult for whoever's in your previous role now. What do you think they can do?
So a lot of this is politics. A lot of this is investment. A lot of this is technology. A lot of this is agreements, international agreements. So I think, if you're looking specifically on the English Channel, let's just take that as an example, the best deterrent to stop people doing that and drowning would be to send them straight back to France. Because France is a safe country. They're signatories to the 51 conventions. You don't need to come to the UK to claim asylum if you can claim asylum in France. But they don't want to claim asylum in France. They want to get to the UK. We haven't been able to achieve a safe third country agreement to return them from France. The French don't want them back for political reasons, really, because they've got more than enough asylum seekers of their own very much. And why would they stop people leaving their country if they want to leave their country? If you can't send them back to France, and if they're from places originally like Iran, Syria, Afghanistan, which is most of the high intake cohorts, you can't send them back there either. I mean, there's a very good chance actually they will qualify for asylum, but even if they don't, we don't have the mechanisms and agreements to be able to document them to send them back to those countries. Ergo, people from those countries are going to pay a smuggler €5,000 because the narrative will be that all you need to get is within 12 miles of the British coastline. You're then in UK jurisdiction. You can then claim asylum and you will never, ever be sent back. So that's why actually I was quite a big advocate of the Rwanda Plan that the last government brought up. It was an idea which was kicked off in Australia 10 years ago under something called Operation Sovereign Borders, where actually we say, well, no, you can't come into our country to claim asylum. We will find somewhere else that is prepared to accept you. We will pay them money to accept you, but they are happy to accept you under certain terms and conditions. And if you want to claim asylum, you can claim asylum there. So we're not returning you to a country where you fear persecution. There's no risk of refoulement. They won't return you there either because that's part of the deal. And that would then deter people, I think, from making these crossings because they don't really want to end up in Rwanda. They'd rather end up in London or Birmingham or Manchester. So I think without that removals deterrent, people are going to continue to come. Now, this government have come in the UK to say we're going to smash the gangs. I spent quite a lot of time dealing with human smugglers in my career. But that's a really, really difficult thing to do because most of them don't operate in the UK. They actually operate in mainland Europe and beyond. They're quite difficult to track down, and you will inevitably still need the cooperation of the local police enforcement agencies, legal systems, frameworks, etc., to enable you to fulfil that task. So whilst the National Crime Agency do have some successes in terms of working with the Germans or the Dutch or the Turks on certain aspects of it, it's really, really difficult to take all of those gangs out of business when the money is so, the rewards are so significant. You can make a huge amount of money, and quite a lot of people that are arranging these things are illegal migrants themselves, who haven't been able to make it across, but said, well, actually, if I can't get across, I'll just take money from you. And I'll put you in a boat and you pay me. And actually, I don't really need to make it across because I'm making lots and lots of money where I am. So I think that's a really difficult task. Not that we shouldn't be trying to do it. Of course we should. But I think without that removals deterrent, I think then people are going to keep coming.
Sir Keir Starmer, when he was in opposition, was against the Rwanda Plan. But now he's talking about processing claims in Serbia, Albania. And what's the difference between the two? And give us a bit more thoughts on what you think about processing claims abroad.
Yeah, well, I thought the Rwanda Plan was particularly bold because it actually said you can't claim asylum in the UK at all under the Article 31 interpretation, is that you're not in immediate fear of persecution because you come from France. So you're not getting into our asylum system at all. If you want to claim asylum, you can do that in Rwanda. Even if they give you asylum, you're still not going to get to come to the UK. That's it. You're going to be banned from the UK. That was the Rwanda Plan. Some of these other things we're hearing about with the Albanians and the Italians, for example, is what's called offshoring rather than outsourcing. In other words, well, you can claim asylum here if you turn up in my country. We will give you asylum if you qualify for it, but we're not going to allow you to stay here while we consider your claim. So you will go to another country, Albania, and you will stay there until we've decided whether or not to give you asylum in our country. If we do decide to give you asylum in our country, well, then we'll bring you back over and you can come and live here, which is quite different from the Rwanda Plan, which didn't matter whether you qualified for asylum or not. The whole process has been outsourced to another country, and the government struggled to make, to at least make the legal case that this was A, in line with the 51 conventions, and B, a safe country, Rwanda. Now, I would argue it is a safe country because actually the UNHCR are already housing a very significant number of refugees from places like Libya and Tunisia in Rwanda. And I went to Kigali a couple of times and we invested a huge amount of money in making sure that they would be made safe and they would have been welcomed in Rwanda. So I think probably with hindsight, having been elected on a ticket of, well, actually we're going to abolish the Rwanda Plan because it was a bad idea and a gimmick and a waste of money, they probably come in and thought, well, actually, perhaps it wasn't such a bad idea after all, because we can't reverse it. So let's have a look and see what other options we are. But I think all these offshoring options that we're seeing in other countries are just a poor man's Rwanda, really.
The other point I wanted to ask you about, a lot of people complain that the illegal immigrants are pretty much all young males. And is that accurate? And how should we understand it?
Predominantly, the boat arrivals are generally young. That's not to say there aren't women and children. There usually are. I went out on the boats a couple of years ago myself, and there was usually some females on the boat, quite often a pregnant female and a child, because sometimes they're used as levers in actually, by the smugglers. So well, actually, we've got some really vulnerable people on here. You really need to come and rescue us quickly. And so there is a mix, but generally speaking, it's young, working age males from across the world who have the capability, if you like, to cross multiple borders and to survive in the process and to find their way into British territorial waters that make it, as opposed to more vulnerable people who can't make those journeys. So what we used to have was something called the UNHCR resettlement programme, where the UK, Canada, US, Australia would go to UNHCR camps around the world and select the most vulnerable people, which would involve more women and children and people that are really, really in need of resettlement, and bring them over. But of course, because of the vast numbers now that are coming across by these irregular routes, and politically it's simply not acceptable to go and to bring in more people in from camps when you've got more than enough coming across your border by these irregular means, you see. So that's really, I think, why you're seeing these particular people coming across, is those that can, because they've been able to get across multiple borders, and they can survive in the process and then and get into the country that way, whereas it's much, much harder, I think, for women and children to do that.
So how do you think we can break the business model of these people smugglers?
I think we're going to have to come back to some kind of a removals deterrent. I think I would resurrect Rwanda, but I don't think politically this government are going to do that, because they were elected. A lot of Labour supporters actually said we want to abolish this. It's not fair, it's not right, it's not just. But in my experience, the only real way to stop illegal entry is a deterrent. In other words, it's not worth it. There's no point you paying this money. There's no point you putting your life at risk. No point you getting here, because you won't be allowed to stay. And actually, back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, when I was working in immigration enforcement in London or at the border, we did exactly that. If we found you, if you turned up at my desk at Heathrow without a passport, you'd be back on the next plane, straight back where you came from, whether you had a passport or not, actually. And similarly in London, if we found you working illegally somewhere, then we would serve removal notices on you and send you back. Nobody claimed asylum. Nobody claimed human rights. And this was 20, 30 years after the 1951 conventions were signed, because it hadn't really caught on, if you like, that this was an option to you. But gradually people started to realise, well, actually, we can challenge the way governments behave on this, because actually, even though I haven't been admitted to your country, I'm entitled to claim asylum here. You have an obligation under the 1951 conventions to consider my claims for asylum and human rights. That's been extended through the European Court judgments. Some would call it judicial overreach, where more and more judgments, and now we see judgments, some of them really quite perverse judgments, I think most people would say, in the UK immigration tribunals, where you can't send me back, not because I need asylum, but because of my human rights, because actually there's a good reason why it would breach my human rights. I would suffer inhuman or degrading treatment if you sent me back to that country, and so we say, well, all right, then we'll let you stay here. That's not really supported, though, by a lot of people. So, well, actually, why are we allowing people to stay here, potentially foreign national criminals and people that would cause us harm or have caused us harm? Why are we letting them stay here because of their human rights, when they could go on to cause more harm here than if we were to return them? So I think the government's in a real pickle on this, in that it's clear that the smuggling gangs at the moment are winning this. They are winning it on the grounds of money, that they know there is a very, very large supply of irregular migrants in Europe and beyond who will pay for this service, and they know it's very, very likely that if you can get into a boat and get across into the English Channel and into the UK zone, you won't ever be sent back. So it's a never-ending supply. You have to break that supply chain, in my view, or people are just going to keep coming.
Just diving into something you referred to there, what do you think international law has done to Britain's abilities to protect its borders, particularly ECHR, really?
Well, you have to remember why those conventions were signed in the first place. I mean, these were both in 1951, post-Nazi era, where clearly, if you look back at the Second World War history, then there were large numbers of refugees that were escaping Nazi Germany that you wouldn't expect them to pick up a passport and get a visa, and you would expect that it would be reasonable that they would be allowed to claim permission to stay in your country either on the grounds of asylum or human rights. So I think they were well intentioned when they came out in the 50s. It's the interpretation of those conventions and the fact they haven't really been changed ever since they were first drafted. So different courts, different jurisdictions have interpreted those in such a way that I don't think would ever have been intended by those who drafted those conventions in the first place, that somebody could cross multiple borders and use these various levers to get to stay in your country, when actually they were designed for large-scale exodus of refugees, like, from a war zone, which is what we saw with Ukraine recently. Now, that's a completely different situation where governments can react if you get something like that, where large numbers of people are actually fleeing war. Then you can come to it, like we did with the Ukrainian scheme, and you can bring them over. But I don't think it was ever intended that opportunists could use that system to cross multiple borders undocumented to simply achieve their ambition of living in another country. So I think they are outdated, both of those conventions. I don't quite know what the international community are going to do about that, because what we've seen since these UN conventions is more and more governments further to the right being much more protective of their borders and saying, well, actually, I'm answerable to my voters. My voters aren't happy with this. I don't care what happened 70 or 80 years ago. I do care about it, but actually it's not relevant to my current situation. I expect my government, who I voted for, to take control of my borders. And actually quite a lot of people that have run our country in the UK have said they were going to do that, and they failed to do it. So I think that does create a real political tension about, well, if you're going to have strong borders, you're going to have to deliver it. And if you're going to try and do that, then it does challenge those 1951 conventions. And the big fight, of course, here in the UK is the Human Rights Convention. And, some politicians saying, well, we need to get out of that. We can't abide by the ECHR anymore because we can't be subject to these Strasbourg judgments, which undermine our capacity to control our borders. But you still need human rights. We all need human rights. And things like the Good Friday Agreement, things like this were built on the fundamental principles that everybody has a human right, regardless of your political affiliation. So I think there's a lot of work needs to be done to say, well, okay, if we are going to demur from the ECHR, or we're going to reinterpret the ECHR, what are we going to put in its place? The Conservatives are now saying, well, we will just simply exclude all migrants, all asylum seekers from that altogether. It's probably a little bit simplistic, because where do you draw the line between a migrant and someone who's already living here or who's been here for a long time? I think there's a lot more work needs to be done by people much cleverer than I am in terms of legal definitions and interpretations to draft something which would find that ground I think we're looking for, which would stop these perverse decisions that people are being allowed to stay on the most spurious of grounds, immigration and asylum and human rights grounds, so that there is a clear, but that it doesn't absolutely abolish everybody's human rights altogether, which could lead to a UK Bill of Rights. There's other, the Americans, the Australians are not in Europe, they're not in the ECHR, they've got their own separate legislation. But I think a huge amount of work needs to be done, actually, by lawyers and policymakers to work out what is the framework these days for ensuring that you preserve the human rights of those, that are in this country or come to this country. At the same time, you don't allow that to abuse the protection of your borders, which is what most people would expect you to do if you're in charge of a country.
So we're saying it's not the law itself that's the problem, it's this judicial overreach and how it's interpreted. Is this why successive leaders who say they're going to stop the boats keep failing to do so?
Yes, basically. I think that's been going back now to, even till when asylum first started. I mean, I was in the Home Office 2000 to 2004, 2005, which was the previous record. We had over 100,000 asylum seekers, coming, I think, in 2003. They were camping on the beaches in Dover. There was a huge outcry. This was under a Labour government. And there was a huge investment. They tripled the Home Office budget, to get cases cleared. We had to commandeer a lot of bed and breakfasts all along the south coast. But we managed to stop that largely because we moved the border into France. So that was a juxtaposed control. So we put British Border Force officers who are still there in Calais and Dunkirk and at the Paris, at the Eurotunnel, etc., to check passports before you go on. So you couldn't claim asylum in the UK. It's not in the UK. So that actually got intake right down actually to about 25,000, and it stayed at that for a while. But now it's crept up, and now we've got a new record. This last year, 108,000 asylum seekers. Not all of those came on boats. I mean, about 40,000 odd come on boats, but quite a lot of them are coming in on visas, which we've issued, which we should be able to control who we give a visa to, but they're thinking, well, I'll get a visa as a student, and when I get there, I'll claim asylum because it's a good way of getting to stay in the country. So I think there does need to be a very close look at the legislative framework that we've got. I think this government is taking a different view than the previous government. I think the previous government made mistakes. I think this government are making mistakes, but I think what we really need is a legal framework that empowers my former organisation, Border Force, or Immigration Enforcement, the Q's in the title, to exercise some kind of force, enforcement over who gets to come and who doesn't get to come. I think a lot of officers feel completely undermined now because asylum and human rights actually largely trump border control. Once you're in that system, there's nothing we can do until you come out the other end of that system. And even then, it's quite difficult. So what you really need to do is to have a legal framework which enables you to stop people getting here in the first place. And when they do get here, to detain them, screen them and remove them really, really quickly from the country. That's what people would expect if they're turning up without any passports from a safe third country. But that legal framework is not there. This government have just abolished the Safety of Rwanda Act. That's the main purpose of the new Border Security and Immigration Asylum Bill, and will be to abolish Safety of Rwanda Act. So Rwanda is now off the table. But I haven't seen anything come in its place that's going to deter people from coming across the boats, other than extending new powers to the new Border Security Commander and the agencies to be able to use the criminal justice system, if you like, to try and use terrorism powers to investigate more and more of the smuggling gangs and try and break those gangs up. But I think that is not going to do it on its own. I think you need both. And we need a legal framework that achieves both. And we haven't been able to get there.
You mentioned the student visas. I had several guests on the show talking about universities being propped up pretty much by their foreign students now. And do you think the student visa route is still beneficial to the nation?
No, not really. I don't think it is. I mean, the idea of student visas, going back to my time, was that we would open up our very, very good educational systems to overseas students, and the objective was that they would come here and learn new skills which they would take back to them to deliver in their own country. So students wouldn't be allowed to switch into employment or postgraduate schemes or whatever. You would have to be satisfied that they would come, they would do their 3-year course, they'd go back with a diploma, and then they could set up a new, whatever it is, medical facility or something, and actually add real value back home. That was the idea of it. I think what's happened is because we've basically, lots and lots of educational establishments have sprung up now who rely very much upon this business model of bringing students over here. And I think quite a lot of those students aren't primarily here to study. I think that's a byproduct. They're really here because they want to get into the labour market, they want to earn money, and ultimately they want to stay here. And that wasn't really what the student schemes were set up to do, to prop up educational establishments. So I think there's going to be another big battle there between the educational lobbies who say, well, we need more immigration. Well, you would say that if you run a college, I expect, because it's propping up your livelihood. But on the other hand, do you really want lots and lots of people coming here under the guise of being students when actually they're working in the black economy and not going back? And I think that does need tightening up, yeah.
Economic benefit was always one of the key arguments for opening the borders. I mean, when you were in charge, it was the approach. Do you think that approach is still as valid now?
No, I don't. And I think that's because a lot of work's been done by some of the think tanks, some of the policymakers about the economic benefits of migration. I think that has been largely undermined now, the argument that it's good for growth. I mean, there is no doubt population is declining within the indigenous population. I think the replacement rate in the UK is about 1.5 per family. So, the population would go down on its own if left to its own without people coming in. But with people coming, the numbers that are coming in, it's going up much, much more quickly than 2.0. It's going up 2.53. So the population is growing very, very significantly, and the people that are making up the shortfall are people coming in from overseas, not people that have already been living in the UK. Now, so GDP will go up, probably. If you've got more people, the more people you've got producing, then the more growth you will probably get. But it's actually GDP per capita we need to look at. How much are they taking out of the economy? In a welfare state like ours, where you've got, you've got a National Health Service, you've got welfare benefits, you've got all kinds of, things that housing, provision, accommodation, all of those things are actually taking out of the economy. Actually, they're going to people who are coming in from overseas. When people say, well, actually, why are we spending our taxpayers' money on that when actually we don't need it spent on that? We need it spent on us, on people that are already lawfully here that need these services. I think that's causing a political storm. So I don't think the economic benefits of migration are as powerful as some previous chancellors would say. If you look at some of the things that previous chancellors have said, of course, at the Treasury, if there's a meeting in Whitehall, Treasury will always say, of course we need more immigration. That's the answer to everything. We can get more people in here, we can get more taxes paid, health service, we need people from overseas for that. You mentioned the student sector, they will argue for more immigration, the agricultural side. So, when you're sitting around a cabinet table, there's quite a lot of voices saying, immigration's the answer, but actually when you come back to the Home Office who are responsible for this, so actually that's not what people want. You've got to find another way of generating your wealth, which is investment in your own population and investment in your own people, rather than relying on which is essentially just turning on a tap of more and more people, because long term that's not going to be delivering a better GDP per capita for the population. You need to find other ways of doing that. I think that argument is beginning to turn now, but it was certainly carried for a very, very long time by successive governments, including right up to the Boris wave, that we need more people.
What do you think are the key changes we need to make to secure our border better?
Well, as I say, I think we need a removals deterrent. We've got to break the business model of the smuggler, so that it's not worth getting in a boat to come across here anymore. That means finding somewhere to send people to. I would certainly resurrect Rwanda or something very similar to that, and find ways of saying to people, you can't come in here and we're going to send you away. I think we need to be much more robust in detaining people when they arrive here. Our detention estate has been decimated. It's down to about 2,300 beds now. The prison estate is full, so we can't hold on to people. We're letting far too many people into community, in my view, that could be a risk. I would like to keep them for longer, just to make sure they are thoroughly screened, thoroughly vetted. I would want full interrogation of any mobile devices, a lot better risk assessment framework to make sure that we are minimising the chances. And I'd like to see people who come here and commit who get up to no good, like criminals, any other security threats, arrested and deported from the country. I mean, I think that's what most people are saying. Most people think that that's perfectly feasible, but I'm afraid under the legal frameworks that we have right now, then that's really, really hard for the border force and immigration enforcement to deliver.
I also wanted to ask you about terrorism and the threat of terrorism. What impact does this have on your work in border force?
It's a big worry for me, and if you look at my career, I mean, I was director of ports of entry in Canada when 9/11 happened. No one saw that coming. I was director of ports of entry here when 7/7 happened. We didn't see that coming either. When you analyse those scenarios and subsequent scenarios, there has always been a breach of border security somewhere down the line, either because there were things that were going on that we didn't know about, or things that were developing that we didn't have the intelligence to be able to tackle. So I think there is a real threat, actually, and we saw this during the days of the Islamic State, where the Paris attacks, for example, the significant number of those Paris attackers had actually been into the Islamic State and got back into Europe and unnoticed, really, and then blown people up. So although I wouldn't want to overstate it, I wouldn't say, there's hundreds of thousands of terrorists and criminals coming into our country every day, and it is a real worry for me that if we're not thoroughly screening and checking every single person to the nth degree when they come here undocumented, they could slip through the net. And we just recently seen the case of the Iranian spies, that some of whom came in on small boats. I mean, there are a number of cases that I could quote where people have come in who've got criminal records overseas that we didn't know about when they arrived at the UK border, who've gone on to commit murders and atrocities in the UK. So there is a real worry, I think, not just for terrorism, for terrorism, but also for serious criminals, that we're not catching all of them at our borders. And that goes back to the fact that, well, because they're breaching our customary systems of visa checks and passport checks before you can come here, we're not actually doing those checks because we can't, because we don't even know you're coming until we know who you are, until you're within our waters and we pull you out of the sea, basically, and then we're starting from scratch only by what you tell us. Now, there are much, much better data intelligence mining systems being developed by some big companies where they can actually look deep dive into analytics, artificial intelligence, data analytics about your background. Got a lot of social media checks and, things that you can check on people now that we couldn't back in my day because the technology wasn't there. So I think risk assessment frameworks need to get a whole lot better, and we need to be much more prepared to detain people when they arrive for longer than the 24 hours allowed at Manston, because quite often people are coming through there not even being properly debriefed and going straight into hotels. Then we'll try and debrief them later on. It's too late by then.
So they're only allowed to be held for 24 hours before they go onto the hotel?
At Manston they are, because Manston is not a holding centre. It's only a short-term holding centre. It's not a detention centre. So I've been arguing for a detention centre at Manston. It's a huge site. Could easily put a 5-day holding centre in there. You need legal frameworks and powers and planning and all the rest of it, or a long-term. But I would not want to let anybody into my country unless I'd had a really, really good deep dive into who they are and what they're up to. Then fine, if there's nothing we can do and we can't find anything about them, then put them on restriction while their asylum claim goes through. But I am worried that what we're doing at Manston, particularly on a busy day, we're getting hundreds a day, it's all about speed. It's about getting them out of the water, getting them into dry clothes, taking their fingerprints and then getting them off into a hotel. That worries me. I think we need to be much, much more thorough at the point of interception whilst we've got them in our clutches, so that if there is something that we can, and we need to continue to drive really hard to get more data from the EU and from other countries, from Europol, Interpol, so that, because there is no global criminal record of people. You don't know what people have been up to in their own country other than what they tell you. But the more we can gather through these deep dive data analytics, and the more we can get other countries to release information about people to us, the better chance we get of stopping that. But I think it's a real problem for our border security is we're not doing thorough screening, biometric, biographic checks and deep dive analytics on everybody who turns up without a passport.
Do you think we have the technology but we're not making full use of it?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of technology out there that we could be using that we're not using. We're not miles off. I mean, we've got some pretty good systems now, but we're relying a lot on our watch list. I used to own the watch list when I was head of the border force, and it's a bit of a poison chalice, really, because it doesn't follow that because you're not on the watch list, you're a good guy.
Is this an international corporation, this watch list?
Yes. Well, so it's been revised, so the data that's on there will tell you when you put a passport in a slot whether what we know about you, if we know something about you, but it might come up, we don't know anything about you. Doesn't mean to say you're okay. It's just that we don't know what you might have been up to. You might have killed somebody in Serbia before you came over here, and you might have been refused asylum twice in Sweden before you came here, and you might have been up to all kinds of mischief in France, but we wouldn't know, unless you tell us, which you're not going to do, because it's not on the computer. So we've got to be very careful about this computer says no, and we've got to think much more carefully about being able to have proper trained debriefers that can spend time with people and investigate what they're saying, certainly interrogate mobile devices, because there's a lot of stuff on there that we should be capturing and checking that we're not, and do a much more thorough risk assessment. So the technology is developing all the time. Really important the government keeps up with that and make sure that we make the very, very best use of latest technology, data analytics, photograph analysis, all these kind of things that we can do to ensure that we're trying the very best we can to secure our border so this doesn't happen. But I mean, it's a very, very difficult task given the numbers that are coming through.
So not long before we came for this interview, someone was sentenced for smuggling people across the Mediterranean in the UK. So that suggests that international cooperation is actually really important. I mean, this is something that's happening elsewhere. They must need the involvement of various police forces, etc.
Yeah, and to be fair, the National Crime Agency have done a good job in working with other countries, and these new powers will help because they are extraterritorial. It does mean that there are things we can do on overseas, where crimes are being perpetrated, we could bring people to the UK to face the criminal justice system here. And as you say, so we are able to prosecute some people now that perhaps we couldn't without those powers. But I don't think bringing international criminals into the UK and bringing them into the criminal justice system is actually going to stop them. I think the idea to stop them altogether is to break their business model and disrupt their activities, and that's really what a lot of those overseas activities are about, is breaking the financial cycle, tracing the money and shutting them down, rather than going through quite a tortuous process to bring people to court where you need a lot of evidence and a lot of cooperation from other countries. So it is possible to do that, but you really want to put them out of business, you've got to disrupt their business model.
Yeah. I was also hoping you could just talk to us about events. I know you were part of the London 2012 team for the Olympics. And what's it like managing events like that and keeping them secure?
Scary. Scary. I should never forget the London 2012 experience because I'd already been through senior position on my watch in Canada and in UK where we'd been subject to severe terrorist attacks. So I did know quite a bit about it, and I suppose the inevitability that eventually, who we're going to find somebody to do border security for London 2012 Olympics. Well, Tony Smith's been there and he's got the T-shirt, surely lightning can't strike 3 times. But I think a couple of things I learned in doing all that is, first, it wasn't just me. Of course, it wasn't just me. I mean, there were lots of other agencies involved, and what you really need to do is deliver something which is called integrated border management. In other words, everybody in law enforcement community is engaged in the risk assessment framework. So I had, I was Gold Commander for UK Border Agency, but there were gold groups in the police, there were Gold Command National Crime Agency, military, secret services were all brought together, if you like, under a programme structure to deliver security for the London 2012, and I was a part of that. And that enabled us to do things that perhaps we wouldn't do under business as usual, because we got to know people who we probably wouldn't have met otherwise if we're staying in our own departments. We got to discuss how could we get data shared around the various agencies, because these all had their own watch lists. I had a border watch list, but these were their own. They're not going to necessarily share it with you, because legally they probably can't. So we did set up an accreditation system where the data did come into my hub, but I was able to send that off on a hub and spoke system to lots and lots of different places. They called it the swivel chair system, I think, where you just basically send it off to lots and lots of other different, and all they needed to do was put a flag up, the next morning and say, no, hold on, there's something about this particular person that we and then you would create a case file from that. You would find out what do they know about this person, and it would be stuff that the Border Force probably didn't know about, but certainly somebody else knew something about, which might or might not, cause us to refuse them accreditation to come to the Olympics. And that gets escalated ultimately right up to the Home Secretary, actually, because it could be quite a fine balance about whether someone is an associate of someone else who's doing something pretty awful. Should that stop them come in here or not? But
is this just people from abroad or people from here as well?
People from here as well, actually. I mean, it's really quite perverse because I was checking British people who weren't crossing any borders. They were actually going into the Olympic Park and out again, but you needed a pass for that, and to get a pass you had to go through the accreditation system. But so the information on people already here was probably much better, enriched by police and local, other law enforcement than me at the border. But we were able to do the necessary checks. But I think the key thing I learnt from that was, what was the risk assessment for London 2012 Olympics? It was severe, which meant a terrorist attack was highly likely. So we knew it was very likely somebody was going to attack us. Therefore, you adjust your response accordingly. If it had been very low, that it's very unlikely there's going to be a terrorist, so then maybe we would have taken a different approach. I'm pretty confident looking back that sadly I probably denied entry to quite a lot of people who were coming in for perfectly reasonable participation in the games, that there was something that we weren't quite happy about. But that's because that's where that risk level was set, and ultimately that's where ministers come in. They have to make the call as to whether or not this person is to be admitted or not. But we had a huge process that we set up under the Olympic accreditation scheme, which worked actually, because we had a fantastic Olympics, and the success for me, the success for me is that everybody's looking at the track and the field and seeing who's winning the gold medals. We didn't want them talking about the border or anything else really, or anything which would have been very newsworthy if there was something going on. But we managed to keep the lid on everything, and we were lots and lots of work going on, very, very hard work, lots of sleepless nights, but we did it. Actually, and it was hugely rewarding to have been able to serve my country in that way, you know, and deliver what was a fantastic, London 2012. It will go down in history as such a fantastic event, and we did our bit really to keep the lid on it, and that was based on years and years of experience in the business, where actually we just tried to make sure that we all used our collective experience, knowledge at the time to minimise the risk, and it worked.
Tony Smith, thank you very much.
Thank you.